The story of the Crusades begins not with a sword, but with a map, one drawn in the minds of medieval rulers who believed geography was destiny. By the late 11th century, Western Europe is a patchwork of feudal lordships bound together by oaths, violence, and faith. Kings are powerful in name, but authority is often local, personal, and enforced at the point of a spear. Across the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Roman statecraft, clings to its wealth and ritual grandeur, yet it is battered by wars and internal strain. Further east, the Islamic world is vast, culturally brilliant, and politically fragmented. Caliphates, emirates, and sultanates that sometimes cooperate, sometimes compete. For centuries, Christians have traveled to the Holy Land. Pilgrimage is not tourism, it is penance, risk, and devotion. Jerusalem is a city of layered sanctities, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Yet sacred places do not exist outside politics. In the decades before the First Crusade, a new power surges into the heart of the Middle East, the Seljuk Turks. Their victories reshape the balance, pressing against Byzantine territory and altering conditions for travelers and local Christians. In 1071, at Manzikert, the Byzantines suffer a devastating defeat. Asia Minor, Byzantium's manpower reservoir, begins to slip away. By 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III Komnenos is desperate. He sends envoys west, requesting military aid. Not an invasion, but mercenaries, reinforcements, a controlled response to stabilize his empire. In Rome, Pope Urban II sees opportunity in crisis. The papacy is locked in a struggle over authority, against emperors, against rival claimants, against the limits of moral power in a violent world. Urban is a reformer, but also a strategist. A grand expedition could strengthen papal prestige, redirect knightly aggression outward, and present the Church as the unifying force of Latin Christendom. At the Council of Clermont in November 1095, Urban calls for a holy war. The rhetoric is charged with salvation and urgency, a journey framed as penance, a battle framed as service to God, and a promise, spiritual reward for those who take the cross. The medieval mind is not modern. For many, religion is not a private identity. It is the architecture of reality. Heaven and hell are not metaphors. They are destinations. The crusade is offered as a path to redemption through action. The response is explosive. Nobles, knights, peasants, and adventurers begin to move. Some are driven by faith, others by hunger, debt, ambition, or the lure of status. Many carry multiple motives at once, sometimes without separating them. In the first waves, discipline collapses. A movement known later as the People's Crusade surges eastward under charismatic preachers. It is poorly supplied and prone to violence. Along the way, some crusaders turn against Jewish communities in the Rhineland, committing massacres that stain the crusading ideal from its first steps. These attacks are not inevitable. They are choices made in a climate of fanaticism, fear, and opportunism, choices condemned by some contemporaries, exploited by others. When the main armies of the First Crusade finally assemble, the expedition becomes something else. A coalition of princes with rivalries, pride, and fragile cooperation. Among them are figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, men skilled in war, shaped by feudal politics and now marching under a banner of sanctity. They arrive at Constantinople, and the tensions surface immediately. The Byzantines want control and restitution. The Crusaders want autonomy and reward. Oaths are negotiated, some sworn, some resented. Trust is thin. In 1097, the Crusaders besiege Nicaea. It falls, but Byzantium moves quickly to take possession, keeping the Crusaders from looting and from claiming the city as their own. This fuels suspicion. Then the Crusaders march across Asia Minor, suffering heat, thirst, and ambush. They reach Antioch, a massive fortified city, and begin a siege that becomes a test of endurance. Hunger and disease spread. The Crusaders are trapped between walls and uncertainty. Eventually, through negotiation and betrayal inside the city, Antioch falls. only for the Crusaders themselves to be besieged by a Muslim relief army. In desperation, morale teeters. A relic is discovered, the Holy Lance, claimed as proof of divine favor. Whether fraud, faith, or psychological necessity, it ignites courage. The Crusaders fight, and against the odds they break out. This is the pattern of the First Crusade. Extreme hardship interpreted through spiritual meaning, victories framed as miracles, and violence presented as cleansing. In 1099, the Crusaders reach Jerusalem. The city's defenses are strong, but the Crusaders are determined, and the siege is swift. When the walls are breached, the conquest becomes a massacre. Medieval warfare is often ruthless, and Jerusalem becomes a symbol of that ruthlessness. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe bloodshed on a terrible scale. It is here, in the final act of the First Crusade, that the three words in our title, faith, power, and blood, interlock with brutal clarity. Faith supplies justification. Power supplies the machinery. Blood becomes the consequence. After the conquest, the Crusaders do not hand the city to Byzantium, nor do they simply go home. They build new states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli. These Crusader States are Latin Christian outposts in a predominantly Muslim region, dependent on fortifications, alliances, and constant reinforcements from Europe. They are feudal societies planted in foreign soil, ruling over diverse populations, Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, through a combination of accommodation and coercion. In the West, the First Crusade is celebrated as proof of divine favor. In the East, it is remembered as an invasion, one that shatters cities, disrupts trade, and introduces a long era of conflict. But history is not a single memory. For local Christians in the region, the arrival of Latin Crusaders can be both protection and oppression, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented. For Byzantium, the Crusade is both assistance and betrayal. For the Islamic world, it is a violent intrusion, yet also a catalyst that will, in time, encourage political unity and military reform. The Crusades have begun, not as a neat series of wars, but as a shifting phenomenon. Military expeditions shaped by religion, statecraft, economics, and human desire. And already, the contradictions are present. The Crusaders speak of liberation and holiness, yet practice conquest and domination. They march for salvation, yet leave behind massacres. They claim to defend Christendom, yet quarrel with fellow Christians. The next chapters, those contradictions will deepen, until the very word crusade becomes both a banner and a warning. Once the Crusader states exist, they must be maintained. That is the quiet truth behind the romance. Fortresses need garrisons, roads require patrols, castles need supplies, and rulers need legitimacy. The early decades are a scramble to survive, and survival forces compromise. Crusader leaders ally with some Muslim rulers against others. Treaties are signed, broken, and signed again. Trade continues. Diplomacy flourishes alongside violence. The frontier is not a solid line. It is a porous zone where merchants, pilgrims, spies, and soldiers cross paths. To sustain these fragile states, new institutions arise that blur the boundary between monk and warrior. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller begin as protective orders for pilgrims and the sick, but evolve into disciplined military organizations with international funding. They become bankers, landlords, and fortification experts, early examples of transnational power. Their vows are religious, their work is war. In their fusion of piety and violence, they embody the Crusades' paradox, sanctity armed, but no kingdom endures without enemies. In 1144, disaster strikes. The county of Edessa, the first Crusader state founded, falls to Muslim forces under Zengi, ruler of Mosul and Aleppo. The shock reverberates across Europe. Edessa's fall exposes how fragile the Crusader project truly is, and it triggers the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade begins with grand hopes and royal prestige. This time, Europe's most powerful figures participate, including King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. A crusade led by kings should mean coordination and strength. Instead, it reveals the same weaknesses as before, magnified by scale. The armies march east with enormous baggage trains, and the logistical demands become crippling. In Anatolia, the Crusaders are harassed and depleted. Disease and starvation do what enemy arrows sometimes cannot. By the time the Crusaders reach the Levant, strategic clarity is already fading. The Crusades' leaders debate targets. Rather than focus on Edessa, they choose to attack Damascus, a city that has at times been allied with the Crusader States against other Muslim powers. The siege is poorly executed, undermined by internal rivalries and distrust. Within days, it collapses. The Crusaders withdraw in humiliation. The Second Crusade ends not with triumph, but with the unsettling realization that crusading zeal alone cannot compensate for poor leadership and fractured purpose. In the Islamic world, the response to the Crusaders is evolving. The early years are marked by division among Muslim rulers. But leaders like Zengi, then his son Nur ad-Din, begin to frame resistance in religious terms, promoting the idea of jihad as both spiritual duty and political unity. This is not simply propaganda, it is a tool of consolidation. By linking legitimacy to the defense of Islam, these rulers knit together territories and armies that had previously competed. The Crusaders, by invading, inadvertently help forge the unity that will eventually challenge them. Meanwhile, the Crusader states mature into societies with their own complexities. Latin lords import European legal customs, but adapt them to local conditions. Cities like Acre and Tyre become hubs of commerce where Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, gain enormous influence. This commercial dimension is crucial. Crusading is not only a religious movement, it is entangled with Mediterranean trade networks, shipping contracts, and profits. Merchants see opportunity in transporting armies and controlling ports. War becomes business, yet the religious narrative remains central, and it shapes the way violence is justified. Crusade preaching intensifies. Indulgences are refined. Taking the cross becomes a social act with spiritual currency. At the same time, the idea of holy war becomes portable. If fighting in Jerusalem can be framed as service to God, why not fighting other enemies of Christendom? This logic spreads crusading outward, to Iberia against Muslim polities, to the Baltic against pagan peoples, and even against Christian heretics in Europe. The crusading mechanism becomes a flexible instrument of power, adaptable to different targets and political agendas. By the mid-12th century, the Crusader States stand at a crossroads. They are fortified and wealthy in places, but strategically vulnerable. They rely on European reinforcements that arrive irregularly. They sit amid a larger population that does not share their faith, even when coexistence is pragmatic. And now, a new force is rising that will redefine the conflict. In Egypt, political turbulence opens a path for a talented Kurdish commander, Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Initially serving under Nur ad-Din's influence, Saladin maneuvers through Egypt's fracturing politics, eventually consolidating control. When Nur ad-Din dies, Saladin moves with careful calculation to unite Egypt and Syria under his leadership. The result is a new strategic reality. The Crusader kingdoms are no longer facing isolated rivals, but a coordinated power with resources, legitimacy, and a coherent vision. On the Crusader side, internal divisions persist. Kingship in Jerusalem is often contested. Noble families compete. Military orders grow powerful, sometimes acting independently of royal control. The frontier is a political ecosystem where alliances shift quickly and where personal ambition can override collective strategy. Then comes a spark. In the 1180s, a Crusader noble named Reynald of Châtillon becomes notorious for raiding caravans and provoking Muslim powers, sometimes violating truces. His actions are not simply local piracy, They threaten the diplomatic frameworks that keep the region from constant war. Saladin, seeking to unify support and assert authority, responds with growing determination. The stage is set for a confrontation that will become one of the most famous in medieval history. In 1187, Saladin's forces meet the Crusader army near the Horns of Hattin, a landscape of dry hills and brutal heat. The Crusaders march under the pressure of thirst and tactical misjudgment. Saladin controls water sources and harasses the Crusader columns. The Crusader army is exhausted, surrounded, and then shattered. The defeat at Hattin is catastrophic. The True Cross relic is captured. Many knights are killed or taken prisoner. The military backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapses in a single campaign. Soon, Jerusalem itself is threatened. Saladin advances, and the city, underdefended and demoralized, faces the same question the Byzantines once faced: resist to destruction or negotiate survival. Unlike 1099, the city's surrender is arranged with terms. Saladin allows ransom and departure for many inhabitants, though suffering and displacement still follow. The contrast is stark. Where the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem is remembered for massacre, Saladin's capture is often remembered for measured control, though it too occurs within a context of war and power. News of Jerusalem's fall spreads across Europe like an electric shock. The sacred city has been lost. The crusading ideal, already strained by failures, faces an existential crisis. If God granted victory in 1099, what does defeat in 1187 mean? The answer in medieval logic is often moral: sin, corruption, lack of unity. The solution proposed is renewed crusade, led this time by the greatest rulers of the age. The Third Crusade is about to begin, and it will become the stage where legend and reality collide, where faith mobilizes empires, where power negotiates with power, and where blood marks every mile of coastline. The Third Crusade begins as a storm gathering over Europe, heavy with the names of kings: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor; Philip II of France; Richard IV of England, remembered as Richard the Lionheart. Their participation signals that the struggle for the Holy Land has become not merely a frontier war, but a central theater of medieval geopolitics. Yet even as they take the cross, their rivalries travel with them. Crusading does not dissolve politics, it intensifies it, placing ambition beneath a halo. Frederick Barbarossa sets out overland with a vast army, a reminder of an older imperial model of power. But the crusade is undone by the hazards of distance. In 1190, Frederick drowns in a river in Anatolia. His death is a shock and a logistical catastrophe. Parts of his army disperse. The remainder continues in diminished force. The episode becomes a harsh lesson. In crusading, fate can be decided not only in battle, but by geography and chance. Meanwhile, the sea becomes the highway of war. Richard and Philip travel by ship, and the naval dimension of the Crusades becomes ever more important. Ports, fleets, and supply lines are the arteries without which armies cannot survive in the Levant. On the way east, Richard becomes entangled in Cyprus, seizing the island, an event driven by a mix of necessity, opportunism, and personal authority. Cyprus will later become a crucial Crusader base, demonstrating how Crusades generate new territorial realities beyond their stated goals. In the Levant, the Crusaders focus on Acre, a strategic port city under siege. The siege has already dragged on, with Crusader forces attempting to retake the city, and Saladin attempting to relieve it. When Richard and Philip arrive, the siege intensifies into a grinding contest of attrition. Assaults, counter-assaults, disease, starvation, and a constant exchange of missiles and artillery. In 1191, Acre finally falls to the Crusaders, but victory brings no unity. Disputes erupt over spoils and authority. Philip returns to France, leaving Richard as the dominant Crusader leader, though not without resentment from other nobles. Richard's campaign becomes a study in medieval generalship. He is bold, tactical, and skilled at maintaining discipline in an army that might otherwise fracture. He wins a notable victory at Arsuf, where Crusader forces withstand Saladin's harassing tactics and then counterattack with force. Yet even Richard cannot escape strategic constraints. Taking Jerusalem is not simply a matter of marching there. It requires supply, water, secure lines of communication, and the ability to hold a city surrounded by hostile territory. Richard approaches, hesitates, approaches again. The decision is agonizing. To capture Jerusalem and then lose it would be worse than not capturing it at all. Opposite Richard stands Saladin, whose reputation grows into near myth. He is not a flawless hero, but a capable leader navigating an alliance of interests, loyalties, and pressures. He must maintain unity among commanders, balance resources, and protect his legitimacy as the defender of Islam. Saladin's strategy often avoids the decisive pitched battle that Crusaders seek, preferring harassment, attrition, and the exploitation of terrain. He understands that Crusader armies are vulnerable to supply disruption and heat. He also understands the politics of endurance. If he can avoid catastrophe, time itself may defeat the invaders. Between these two leaders, a strange respect develops, part diplomacy, part psychological warfare, part necessity. Envoys travel. Terms are discussed. Prisoners are exchanged. The medieval world is capable of brutality and chivalry, sometimes in the same breath. Yet the violence remains constant, and it often escalates at moments when negotiations fail. After Acre's surrender, Richard orders the execution of many prisoners when terms and payments stall, an act that hardens the war's moral boundaries and exposes how quickly ideals can collapse under pressure. By 1192, the Third Crusade has achieved something significant but incomplete. The Crusaders do not retake Jerusalem, yet they secure a strip of coastline and preserve access for Christian pilgrims under negotiated conditions. Richard and Saladin agree to a treaty. Coastal cities remain in Crusader hands. The interior remains under Muslim control. Pilgrims may visit holy sites. It is compromise, not conquest. Richard departs, and on his journey home he is captured and held for ransom. A reminder that crusading is woven into European power struggles as tightly as into Middle Eastern conflict. The Third Crusade thus ends with a paradox. It fails to achieve its central religious objective, yet it reshapes the region's political landscape and cements legendary reputations. It also deepens the logic that crusading is both an act of faith and an expression of power. The same cross that promises salvation can justify conquest. The same prayer that comforts a soldier can precede an atrocity. In the decades that follow, crusading continues, but it changes. The focus shifts, partly because the Holy Land remains difficult to hold, and partly because new political and economic interests pull the Crusades' energy in different directions. One of the most consequential shifts is the growing involvement of maritime powers, especially Venice, whose fleets and financing become indispensable. With that dependence comes influence, and influence can redirect the Crusades' path. This sets the stage for the Fourth Crusade, the most infamous example of crusading turned inward. Initially, the crusade is intended to strike Egypt, considered the key to controlling the Holy Land. But debts mount. Transport contracts with Venice require payment the Crusaders cannot fully provide. The Venetians propose an alternative: help them capture the rival Christian city of Zara as compensation. The Crusaders comply, and a moral line is crossed. Christians attacking Christians under the banner of a holy expedition. From there, the Crusades' course becomes entangled with Byzantine politics. A Byzantine prince offers money and promises of church union if the Crusaders help him seize the throne in Constantinople. It is a bargain with enormous consequences. In 1204, the Crusaders reach the great city not as allies, but as armed arbiters of a dynastic dispute. When politics unravel and payments fail, the crusade mutates into conquest. Constantinople is stormed. The city is looted in scenes of destruction that shock even some contemporaries. Relics are stolen. Treasures are shipped west. A Latin empire is established on Byzantine ruins. For Byzantium, 1204 is a catastrophe from which full recovery is impossible. For the crusading movement, it is an exposed nerve, the ideal of holy war, now clearly vulnerable to manipulation by greed, debt, and geopolitical calculation. For the wider Christian world, it creates an enduring fracture between East and West that will echo for centuries. Yet crusading does not end. It becomes institutional, preached, taxed, planned, often with papal administration more sophisticated than before. Later crusades attempt to regain ground in the Levant, to strike Egypt, to defend remaining crusader enclaves. Figures like Louis IX of France undertake major expeditions, marked by piety and determination, yet also by strategic failure and disease. In 1291, the last major crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, Acre, falls to Mamluk forces. The Latin presence in the Levant collapses, and with it a central chapter of the Crusades closes. But the Crusades are not only the wars for Jerusalem, they have already expanded in meaning and geography. Crusades in Iberia contribute to the long Reconquista. Crusades in the Baltic aim to convert and conquer pagan territories, creating new Christian states through force. The Albigensian Crusade targets Christian heretics in southern France, demonstrating that crusading can be directed at internal enemies when political and religious authority align. By now, the Crusades have become a system, a mechanism of mobilization that merges spiritual incentives with political objectives. It is a medieval version of total commitment where salvation, identity, and authority are fused. And as the system matures, so do its consequences, economic, cultural, and psychological. The Mediterranean becomes more interconnected through trade and war. Ideas travel with armies and merchants. Stereotypes harden. Memories of violence become part of collective identity. The Crusades leave behind not one legacy, but many. Some visible in stone fortresses and city charters, others invisible, embedded in how communities remember one another. To understand the later Crusades, you must understand that crusading is not a single event, but a habit. An engine that can be pointed in different directions. After the loss of Jerusalem and then the collapse of the Latin foothold in the Levant, the question is no longer merely, how do we take the Holy City? It becomes, what does crusading mean now? The answer varies by pope, by king, by merchant republic, and by ordinary believers who still imagine redemption through the cross. In the 13th century, Egypt emerges as the strategic key. The logic is brutally practical. The Holy Land cannot be held if Egypt, with its wealth and manpower, remains hostile. This is why major expeditions, including those led by King Louis IX of France, focus on the Nile rather than Jerusalem's walls. Louis IX is remembered as intensely devout, almost austere in his piety. But devotion does not replace strategy. In 1249, he launches a crusade against Egypt, captures Damietta, and then advances inland. The campaign bogs down amid floodplains, disease, and supply problems. At Mansoura, the Crusaders are checked. The army is weakened by dysentery. Eventually, Louis is captured and ransomed. The crusade ends in failure, and it demonstrates again that medieval warfare, especially far from home, punishes overconfidence with biological cruelty. Louis tries again. In 1270, he leads another crusade, this time targeting Tunis, possibly as a stepping stone or due to political calculations. Disease ravages the camp. Louis dies. The expedition collapses. The image is haunting, a saintly king dying not in triumphant battle, but in the slow misery of epidemic. It is a reminder that the Crusades, for all their rhetoric of glory, are often stories of exhaustion, miscalculation, and the limits of human bodies. Meanwhile, in the Near East, power has shifted. The Mamluks, warrior slaves turned rulers, build a formidable state in Egypt and Syria, disciplined and militarily effective. They view the remaining Crusader enclaves as foreign intrusions and systematically dismantle them. By 1291, when Acre falls, it is not only a military defeat but an ideological one. The idea that Latin Christendom can permanently hold the Holy Land by force has been disproved by time. Yet crusading continues in other arenas, and here the moral and political complexities deepen. In Iberia, Christian kingdoms push south against Muslim polities in campaigns often framed as crusades. The language of holy war blends with dynastic ambition, land hunger, and the consolidation of royal authority. The eventual fall of Granada in 1492 will be celebrated as a religious triumph, but it also marks the culmination of centuries of shifting alliances, coexistence, conflict, and state-building. In Northern Europe, crusading turns into a project of conversion by conquest. The Baltic Crusades target pagan peoples, Prussians, Lithuanians, and others, led in large part by military orders like the Teutonic Knights. Here, crusading becomes colonization, fortresses, settlement, forced conversion, and the creation of new Christian political entities. The rhetoric is salvation. The reality often resembles a frontier empire. And then there are crusades against Christians. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in the early 13th century against Cathars in southern France, is among the starkest examples. Under the banner of religious purification, armies devastate towns, seize lands, and strengthen the French crown's reach into the south. The crusade is not only about doctrine, it is about control. It reveals how crusading can be used to enforce orthodoxy and centralize authority within Europe itself. This is crucial. By the later Middle Ages, crusading is an administrative and financial system. Popes can grant indulgences and authorize taxation. Kings can harness crusading to legitimize campaigns. Military orders can become entrenched institutions with lands across Europe. In this sense, crusading helps build the infrastructure of later state power, taxation, bureaucracy, propaganda, and coordinated mobilization. But it also creates opportunities for abuse, because any system that promises spiritual reward can be exploited by those who profit from mobilization. The relationship between crusaders and local populations in the Middle East is equally complex. The image of constant religious war is misleading. In many periods, truces and trade are common. Markets function. Local Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syriac, Armenian, sometimes cooperate with Crusader rulers, sometimes resist them, sometimes simply endure. Muslims in Crusader territories can be taxed and governed through pragmatic arrangements. Coexistence exists, but it is fragile, and it can be shattered when military pressure rises or ideological rhetoric hardens. On the Islamic side, resistance to Crusaders evolves from fragmented reaction to institutional power. The language of jihad becomes more politically central, used to justify unity and legitimize rulers. But, as in the Christian world, religious language is both sincere and strategic. Leaders invoke faith while pursuing territory, prestige, and stability. The Crusades thus produce a mirror effect. Both sides develop narratives of sacred defense, both sides sanctify war, and both sides create memories that will outlast the actual battles. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 remains a turning point within this broader story, because it exposes the Crusades' vulnerability to economic and political capture. Venice's role illustrates how maritime logistics can shape outcomes. Without ships, Crusades fail. With ships, Crusades become dependent on those who provide them. The result is that commercial interests can redirect religious campaigns, and once redirected, a crusade can turn against targets that make sense financially or politically, even when they contradict the original spiritual mission. For Byzantium, the consequences are devastating. A Christian empire is dismembered by a Christian crusade. The Byzantine world fractures into successor states. Even when Byzantine rule is partially restored later, the empire is weakened, and the long-term balance against rising Ottoman power is altered. The Crusades, intended in part to aid Byzantium, end up contributing to its decline. The irony is historical and brutal. As the medieval world moves toward the 14th and 15th centuries, the idea of crusade does not vanish, it migrates. The Ottoman Turks expand into southeastern Europe, and crusading rhetoric is used to frame defensive wars. Battles like Nicopolis, 1396, become crusading ventures that end in disaster. Yet even these late crusades carry the same pattern. Coalition armies with competing agendas, logistical challenges, and the problem of underestimating an enemy who has adapted to new forms of warfare and organization. By now, the Crusades have reshaped the Mediterranean in ways that cannot be undone. Italian city-states grow rich, transporting armies and controlling trade. European knowledge of Eastern goods intensifies desire for spices, silks, and luxury, desire that later helps drive exploration. At the same time, cultural contact is not only economic, it is intellectual. Texts, medical knowledge, and philosophical ideas move through translation networks that involve Muslims, Jews, and Christians. The Crusades do not create this exchange. Much of it predates them. But war and proximity accelerate awareness, rivalry, and imitation. And yet, for all the commerce and scholarship, the emotional legacy is heavy. The Crusades create stories of martyrdom and heroism, but also memories of massacre and betrayal. These memories become raw material for later polemics. Crusader and infidel become labels that compress complex human beings into enemies. The phenomenon does not end when the last fortress falls. It persists in language, in symbolism, in political imagination. By the late Middle Ages, Europe's religious landscape is changing. The unity of Western Christendom fractures in the Reformation. The papacy's ability to mobilize entire societies under a single religious banner declines. States grow stronger and their wars become increasingly about dynastic and national interest. The crusading system loses centrality, but the crusading idea, war justified as sacred mission, does not disappear. It simply takes new forms in new ages. The Crusades, then, are not a single story with a single moral. They are a continuum of campaigns that fused devotion and domination. They generated institutions that strengthened states and churches. They produced cultural encounters and hardened boundaries. They created saints and warlords, pilgrims and profiteers, treaties and massacres. And they left behind a legacy that demands careful explanation, because the Crusades are too often simplified into slogans. The reality is more unsettling. A world where faith was real, power was personal, and blood could be consecrated by words spoken in God's name. If you stand back from the battles and look at the Crusades as a whole, what you see is not a straight line, but a web, intersecting motives, institutions, and consequences that changed both Europe and the Middle East. The Crusades are often narrated as a clash of civilizations. That phrase is tempting because it is dramatic, but it can also be misleading because it turns centuries of shifting alliances and internal conflicts into a single, permanent hostility. Medieval people did not live in abstractions. They lived in cities, villages, dynasties, and markets. They married, traded, betrayed, prayed, and feared. Their identities mattered intensely, but they were not always the only axis of decision. Faith in the Crusades is not a costume placed on politics. It is a force that shapes the meaning of life and death. For many crusaders, the journey is genuinely spiritual. They sell property, leave families, and face terrifying odds with the belief that suffering can cleanse sin. This is not a trivial motivation. In a world without modern medicine, without secure travel, without a strong state monopoly on violence, salvation is not an abstract idea. It is a form of existential insurance and hope. But faith alone does not move armies. Power does. The Crusades are a mechanism through which popes attempt to assert leadership over Christian Europe, and through which kings attempt to display legitimacy, discipline their nobles, and expand influence. The papacy gains tools, preaching networks, indulgence frameworks, taxation and administration. Monarchs learn that ideology can mobilize resources. In this sense, crusading contributes to the evolution of governance. It helps create the habits of large-scale coordination, finance, and messaging that will later become features of early modern statecraft. Blood is the unavoidable consequence of mixing sacred conviction with political objectives. Crusading warfare is often extreme, not only because medieval war is harsh, but because sacred framing can remove restraints. When an enemy is defined as spiritually illegitimate, violence can be interpreted as purification. That logic appears in massacres of Muslims and Jews, but also in crusades against Christians labeled heretics. The Crusades reveal a recurring human danger. When violence is fused with moral certainty, cruelty can become a virtue in the eyes of perpetrators. Yet the Crusades also produce contact, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, that changes societies. In the Levant, Crusader states become crossroads of languages and practices. Europeans encounter sophisticated systems of administration, medicine, and urban life. Muslim and Jewish scholars are part of a broader intellectual world that has preserved and expanded classical knowledge, and through translation movements, especially in places like Spain and Sicily, some of that knowledge flows into Latin Europe. Again, the Crusades do not invent these exchanges, but they occur within the same Mediterranean context and are influenced by the intensification of travel and trade. Trade, indeed, is one of the Crusades' quiet engines. Italian maritime republics build fortunes transporting troops and controlling ports. Their ships connect war to commerce in a cycle where conflict creates demand for logistics, and logistics create leverage over strategy. This commercial empowerment reshapes Mediterranean politics and helps lay foundations for later European expansion. But it also means crusading is never purely idealistic. Money is always present. Ransom, plunder, taxation, contracts, and the economic dreams of younger sons seeking land. On the Islamic side, the Crusades push political consolidation. The early fragmentation that allowed the First Crusade to succeed gradually gives way to stronger, more centralized powers. Leaders like Nur ad-Din and Saladin use religious legitimacy to unify territories and rally support. The Mamluks later institutionalize military effectiveness and systematically eliminate Crusader enclaves. In this sense, Crusader invasion contributes to the maturation of regional political military structures. The Crusades become part of the Middle East's story of state formation and defense. For Byzantium, the Crusades are a tragedy written in irony. The First Crusade begins with a Byzantine request for help. The result is a Western military presence that both assists and undermines Byzantine interests. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 is one of medieval history's most destructive episodes, an event that demonstrates that the Crusades are as much about power within Christendom as power against outsiders. The weakening of Byzantium contributes to the shifting balance that will later facilitate Ottoman expansion, culminating in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In that long arc, the Crusades are not simply a war between religions. They are also a civil conflict within Christianity over authority, wealth, and control of strategic space. How should the Crusades be remembered? The answer depends on who is remembering and why. In medieval Europe, crusading becomes part of a moral narrative about defending the faith and reclaiming holy places. In parts of the Islamic world, crusading is remembered as invasion and resilience, an episode that becomes symbolic of resistance to foreign domination. In Jewish memory, the Crusades are also associated with trauma, particularly the Rhineland massacres, evidence that crusading fervor could turn inward against vulnerable minorities. These memories do not cancel each other out. They coexist, sometimes uneasily, shaping identities long after the swords have rusted. Modern discussions of the Crusades are often politically charged, because crusading language can be revived for contemporary purposes. That is another part of the legacy. The Crusades become a reservoir of symbols. Crosses, crescents, Jerusalem, Saladin, Richard. These names can be invoked to simplify conflicts into moral binaries, but simplification is historically dangerous. It erases the diversity within both Christian and Muslim societies, the local alliances, the pragmatic treaties, and the internal struggles that shape decisions. It also risks turning history into ammunition. A documentary view demands a more disciplined approach. The Crusades were not a single war, but a series of campaigns spanning nearly 2 centuries, shaped by changing contexts. They begin in an age of feudal fragmentation and papal reform, and they end in an age of stronger states and shifting religious authority. Their targets broaden from Jerusalem to Egypt, Spain, the Baltic, and southern France. Their participants include kings and peasants, monks and merchants, imperial diplomats and local militias. Their outcomes include both catastrophic violence and complex cultural contact. And so the Crusades resist a clean verdict. They show how sincerely held beliefs can be manipulated by institutions. They show how political goals can be cloaked in spiritual language, and how that cloak can motivate extraordinary sacrifice. They show how war can accelerate trade and exchange even as it hardens prejudice. They show how decisions made in moments of zeal, at Clermont, at Jerusalem's walls, at Constantinople's gates, can echo for centuries in the structure of empires and in the memories of peoples. In the end, perhaps the most accurate way to understand the Crusades is to see them as a mirror of the medieval world's core tensions. A world where salvation was real and urgent. A world where power was personal and precarious. A world where violence was a daily instrument of order, and where the promise of holiness could sanctify the unspeakable. The Crusades are not merely about the past. They are a case study in what happens when the human hunger for meaning is welded to the machinery of war. The last Crusader fortress falls, the last crusading army disperses, and the Mediterranean continues to churn with ships. Cities rise, states consolidate, religions evolve. But the word crusade endures, heavy with contradiction. Faith that inspired courage and cruelty, power that built institutions and destroyed lives, blood that drenched the ground from Jerusalem to Constantinople, from Spain to the Baltic. To explain the Crusades is to explain that contradiction, and to recognize that history, like human nature, rarely offers purity. It offers consequence.